Hello, thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I'm talking about Zodiac by Robert Graysmith, published in 1986, and I'm comparing it with the movie Zodiac, directed by David FIncher and released in 2007. And this, of course, is the true story of the Zodiac killer, who was a person in the Bay Area starting in 1969. And there is no, end date, because he was never caught. His identity is still unknown. Eventually, he did stop writing letters, so there's an end date as far as that goes, but yeah, he was never caught. He could be alive still today for all we know. But he became so infamous in part, there was the mystery because he never was found. But he would also write letters. So in 1969 is when the San Francisco Chronicle, along with other newspapers, received a letter from him, and he was confessing to a murder that had taken place, and he included this encrypted message, and he was like, "Oh, I will tell you my identity in the encrypted message." And he wanted them to print the encrypted message in the newspaper on the front page. And so the next day it was printed. And so then people throughout California, as well as different government agencies and stuff, were trying to figure out this message. And yeah, he kept writing letters, and he kept threatening them, telling them they had to print them on the first page. And he also just said some pretty crazy stuff. And eventually he caught the attention of Hollywood, and they made the movie Dirty Harry, which of course is incredibly famous, starring Clint Eastwood. And yeah, that killer, I think he's called something else, like Gemini or something, but it is based on the Zodiac. And then the character of Dirty Harry is kind of based on Toschi, who is the main investigator for the Zodiac case. And yeah, I kind of feel like it was wrong of them to make a movie about a case that was still ongoing. And yes, they fictionalized it, but a lot of it came from what was actually happening. And they did it in 1971 when it was still happening and still ongoing. So I don't know. I feel like looking back, even though Dirty Harry is so popular now, I feel like that was in bad taste to have made a movie like that at that time. And obviously the Zodiac, he was incredibly narcissistic, among other things. And so it's kind of frustrating that he got the fame that he so desired, right? And maybe people don't know who he is, but him as the Zodiac has become very famous, and most people know about him. And so even I feel conflicted talking about this, doing an episode on it, because here I am, another person just giving attention to the Zodiac, to this terrible person who doesn't deserve attention or fame. And this is one reason why I really like the book Notes on an Execution, because it talks about our society's obsession with killers and how disrespectful that can be to the victims, right? And in the book, Graysmith talks about a woman who was a babysitter. She was babysitting the kids of one of the women who ended up being killed. And so she was babysitting for her the night she was killed. And the babysitter said that years after that event, whenever she heard anything about the Zodiac in the news, it was difficult for her and triggering and upsetting, and she relived that night all over again. And that was just the babysitter of a woman. So imagine the family of the loved ones, as well as there were people who survived attacks. So imagine the survivors too, how much worse it is for them when they see this constantly coming up in the news and movies and books and whatever. And so just having to relive this horrible experience over and over again because people won't stop talking about it. So yeah, after saying all that, why am I here talking about it? Why am I making an episode about this too? And yeah, I don't really know how to justify it to make myself feel better about talking about this. But I read the book and I watched the movie, so I feel like I should use that for content, right? Which that's I'm no better than Robert Graysmith, right? Trying to profit off of this horrible event. I don't know. Maybe I won't have this video monetized, and that'll be my way of trying to feel okay about talking about this. And you could say, this happened 50 years ago now, so there's that. But 50 years ago wasn't that long. There's still people that are alive from this, right? The killer himself could still be alive for all we know. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I just wanted to have a disclaimer saying that I do feel conflicted about this because I am not a fan of the serial killer fascination, and I think it's just kind of in bad taste, and it's disrespectful, and it's seeing it as entertainment when yeah, it's entertainment, but these were also real people, and also these men are super narcissistic, and so here we are feeding into that narcissism and giving them so much attention, right? And so I don't like that either, giving attention to these people who are so despicable and disgusting and don't deserve it. And then the fact that this guy never was caught, right? And so it almost feeds into that narcissism of him. He thought he was so smart and so clever, and the cops will never catch me. And then they never did catch him. So yeah, I wish he was caught, and I wish he, got the death sentence or was at least rotting away in prison right now. But He's not. Anyway, having said all that, let's get into the book review. So Graysmith was a cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle when the first letter came in, and he quickly became obsessed, and through the decades, I mean, it was 69, and then he published the book in 1986, so that was less than 2 decades, but he was like very obsessed with it and trying to figure out everything he could, trying to figure out who the identity of the killer was. And he even wrote another book called Zodiac Unmasked, which was released in 2002, but the movie Zodiac, which I have my little display thing right here, that one is only based on the first book, so I didn't bother reading Zodiac Unmasked, and I just didn't have an interest either. But yeah, if anyone has read Zodiac Unmasked, comment down below and let me know if it's even worth reading and like if there's extra stuff you learn that's interesting enough to read. But yeah, overall I did find this book very compelling and it pulled me in, and I was in a bit of a reading slump where even audiobooks, I had a hard time being motivated to even listen to anything. But then I started listening to this while I was in San Francisco, so it did set the mood in a sense, running around these areas where, this was happening. Definitely made me feel more on guard. Yeah, it got me out of my reading slump and it got me interested. So it was well written. I was worried it would be kind of dry and just kind of him stating the facts. But yeah, I thought it was well done. Having said that, it also was obviously very upsetting and also just so frustrating, and it made me so angry at times. Like some of these letters the Zodiac wrote, and he was just, it just made me so angry, the stuff he was saying. And again, this is about a killer, so there is some upsetting content as well. So I would give you that heads up. And again, going back to, just Graysmith is making money off of this guy. And like, does he donate any of his profits to the victims' families, or is he just profiting off of these people's deaths and not doing anything to help? Granted, he thinks he is helping, right? Because he was trying to figure out the identity. And I guess his book did kind of help and reopen the case in some ways, but ultimately the killer never was caught. So you could argue, like, was he really all that helpful to begin with? Or is he just profiting off of this, But maybe I'm being too harsh and judgmental of him. So share your comments down below on all of this that I'm saying, and if you agree with me or if you think I should tone it down a bit and not be so upset and so self-righteous, especially since here I am making a video about it. Yeah, anyway. But some people actually wonder if Graysmith himself is the Zodiac, which that would fit the Zodiac's MO, right? To be so prideful as to write a book about yourself, acting like you're someone else trying to figure out the case. And also, Graysmith had inside information because he worked at the newspaper, and then, he became friends with, I think it was Toschi is how you say his last name. So he became friends with the cops, and so he was up to date with the happenings on the case, and he knew who the suspects were, and it does make sense in a way. And I don't think Graysmith is the Zodiac, but at the same time, if like on his deathbed he confessed to it, I wouldn't be completely shocked. But again, I don't think it actually was him, but that would be wild if it was. And on to the movie review. So when this movie came out on DVD, my dad and I watched this 3 nights in a row. So, and since then I have seen it at least once or twice more. And so I've seen it a number of times, and it was a movie that I still remembered fairly well all these years later, thanks to having seen it so much. David Fincher is of course a fantastic director, and he is known for being very meticulous. So meticulous, in fact, that there's a scene where like Jake Gyllenhaal is holding something and it's an up close of his hands, and David Fincher thought that Jake Gyllenhaal's hands were just like too pretty, and so he CGI'd like hairs on his hand, which is, very David Fincher, right? But we have Jake Gyllenhaal playing Robert Graysmith, as well as Robert Downey Jr. as Paul Avery, and Mark Ruffalo as David Toschi. So an amazing cast, all-star cast, and these are all people who went on to be in superhero movies, but this was 2007, even before Iron Man came out. So it is cool seeing these actors pre-Marvel movies. And David Fincher did make sure to not show the Zodiac's face, and the Zodiac is not like a key character. Obviously it's about him in a sense, but we don't see anything from his perspective, and he made sure to never show his face, and he did this intentionally because in one of the letters the Zodiac wrote, he was saying how like he's excited for this to be turned into a movie someday, and he can't wait to see who will play him. And so David Fincher didn't want to have like anyone playing Zodiac, and he was never seen, and so he just didn't want to give the Zodiac that satisfaction, right? Especially, if a big name actor were cast as him, and so he just really didn't want to do that. So I think that was a good call. And then he also doesn't show any events where there aren't witnesses for it because there were two men who survived Zodiac attacks. And so those events are shown because we have witnesses, firsthand accounts that can say what happened. But the other events, if we don't have a firsthand account, then it's not shown in the movie, which again, I think was a good call. And this movie is fairly long. I think it was like 2 hours and 40 minutes or something, but it really does fly by. And it's just so well done, and it's very captivating and very atmospheric and amazing performances. And it's very eerie, of course, and unsettling, while also having, which I don't need humor in all of my movies, but there are like a couple moments where, you know, there's some kind of a joke made, which sort of helps lighten the tension, but it's overall a very serious movie, of course. I do wish we would have looked more into the lives of those who died, but we don't really see much about them. And this is, like the book, this does focus on the people who were trying to solve the case and to identify the killer. But from here on out, I'm going to be getting into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers, quote unquote, which I don't know how much of a spoiler I can really give because this is a true story. And I've already said that the killer never was caught. So that's like the biggest thing right there, is that we never do find out who he was. But again, I guess maybe I shouldn't have said that at the start, but I don't think of that as being a spoiler, considering this is like an infamous case that I feel like a lot of people already know about anyway. But to start with Robert Graysmith. So Jake Gyllenhaal plays Robert Graysmith, and he is the lead character in this movie. Whereas in the book, like, he's the one writing the book, and he mentions being at the San Francisco Chronicle when the first letter came in, but he doesn't talk about himself like personally in his personal life. He never gets into that. And he doesn't even make himself a character in the story until like 3/4 of the way in, and that's when he talks about the interviews he was doing, the people he was talking to. So for the majority of the book, he's just telling it like as an outsider, just telling the story and the events that happened. And the movie starts out with him being divorced, but then partway through he meets this woman who he starts dating, and they eventually end up marrying. But then years down the road, when he becomes like even more obsessed with trying to figure out this case, and he also like cracks one of the Zodiac's codes that no one had been able to crack for a really long time. And so he ends up going on the news talking about it, and then he is like in a newspaper article, like, and so people know that he is trying to solve the Zodiac case. And his wife is like, "You went on TV? Like, you did this newspaper interview? Like, the Zodiac reads the newspaper. We know that." And so your face is there on TV. He knows your name. Like, you're putting your life and your family's life in danger by doing this. But he just keeps on doing it. And eventually she ends up leaving him, partly because she thought, you know, he pushed things too far with their safety. They also started getting phone calls of just like someone breathing, and that was it. But also because he was just becoming so obsessed, right? And like figuring out this case became his priority. And in real life, Robert Graysmith, again, he doesn't get into any of this in the book, but in real life, according to Wikipedia, he was married from 63 to 73. And remember, the first letter came in 69. And then his second wife he was married to from 75 to 80. And so it's interesting because in real life, both wives experienced part of his Zodiac obsession, at least to some extent. So I wonder if even the first wife, if that had to do with the reason for their divorce, or if it was mainly the second wife where that became a thing. And I did see a quote where after he saw the movie for the first time, like, his reaction was, "No wonder my wife left me," because I guess he didn't quite realize, you know, he was so in his own head and in his own world that he wasn't realizing the effect that this was having on his family, because he was just so self-involved in a sense, trying to figure out this case. And so this movie apparently helped give him that perspective where he was like, wow, it makes sense now. But again, in the book, he never gets into his personal life at all. Maybe in the 2002 book he does, but I haven't read that. And since writing the Zodiac, he has stopped being a cartoonist at this point, and he has focused on just on doing like research on these real life crimes. And he wrote another book about like a famous guy who was killed. I forget his name, but it's the basis for the movie Autofocus, which came out before Zodiac. And that movie has like Greg Kinnear, who I do like. So that would be an interesting one to cover. So if you want me to cover Autofocus, comment down below and let me know. And then to talk about Paul Avery. So Paul Avery worked at the San Francisco Chronicle, and so he was kind of in charge of writing about the Zodiac case. And in the movie, it seems like Graysmith and Avery were like on friendly terms, like they started talking and sharing information and stuff. Whereas in the book, that wasn't the case. They both worked at the San Francisco Chronicle, but they weren't like friendly and hanging out the way we see them hang out in the movie. But in both, Avery finds connections between the Zodiac and these 1966 murders that happened in Riverside, California, so he links the two of those. And then soon after that, he gets a letter from the Zodiac threatening his life. And so after this, in both book and in the movie, everybody at the newspaper starts wearing pins that say, "I'm not Paul Avery," because the Zodiac threatens to kill Paul Avery, so they're all being like, I'm not Paul Avery, including Paul Avery is wearing one of these pins. And so I did think that was funny. But in the movie, Paul Avery, he had like a drinking problem, and eventually he just kind of succumbs to his alcoholism and he leaves the San Francisco Chronicle. And whereas in real life, Avery, he did leave the San Francisco Chronicle and he went to go work at the Sacramento Bee. But at the Sacramento Bee, he was like writing award-winning work. So he didn't like become a bum the way it kind of makes it seem like he did in the movie. But the movie does have a great scene where Graysmith goes to visit Avery on his houseboat. Avery gets upset at Graysmith and he's like, hey, you know, this is like years in the future. And so he's like, hey, like back during the Zodiac, like all you did was like hover around my desk and dig through my trash can to figure out information. And you were just like leeching off of me. And so that was a really great moment. And people in the movie definitely like get tired of Graysmith more so than is shown in the book. So again, he and Avery didn't know each other in real life. So this is entirely fictionalized. But I did think that was interesting how in the movie, there's more people that are just like, hey, like you're being too much right now. His wife, Avery, David Toschi. And so it's interesting that we don't see that in the book, but I wonder if people did feel that way, but Graysmith maybe was kind of too dense or he just didn't want to write about that, you know. But to talk about David Toschi, so he and this other guy, Armstrong, were the two in charge of the case. And Toschi was a big deal at the time, and he had even been an on-set advisor for the movie Bullet, which starred Steve McQueen and took place in San Francisco. And so, you know, he was a big deal cop. But through the years, he received a lot of flack for not being able to solve the case. But the killings also happened in different counties. And so it wasn't just on David Toschi, because there were other people too. These different police departments had to be sharing information, but it seems like they weren't very good at communicating and sharing information, partly because this was, you know, the 70s and it was, you know, more difficult. You couldn't just email things over. And so that also caused a lot of confusion and could contribute to the reason as to why he was never caught. But at one point in the 70s, the Zodiac, he stopped writing letters for about 4 years. And then when he did write a letter again, he mentioned David Toschi by name. And so after a while, though, people were like, wait a minute, like that seems like, why did he name Toschi in particular? And so then they started to suspect that David Toschi wrote the letter himself. And he had previously written a letter to a cartoonist at a different newspaper. And this cartoonist, in his cartoon, he had a character that was like based on David Toschi. So David Toschi had written like a fan letter, quote unquote, pretending to be someone else, saying how much he loved the Toschi character. So he was kind of like writing himself fan mail. But then when this letter from the Zodiac came in, the cartoonist was like, hey, like that new Zodiac letter is kind of similar in tone to the letter I got like a couple of years ago or whatever. And so, yeah, people thought that Toschi wrote that letter himself, and it was obviously very humiliating. And then he was, you know, seen as a suspect almost for a while to see if he was the killer. But as time went on, he was eventually cleared of that accusation, and people no longer think that he wrote that letter. But like I said, in this movie, it gets to the point after this letter comes in and Toschi is accused, he gets to the point where he like needs to take a break from Graysmith, who just keeps calling him and won't leave him alone. And they're just like, hey, we've had enough of this. We need to step away from things. Like, you're being too much. And he doesn't talk to him again until later on when Graysmith has more information, and he comes to Toschi's home in the middle of the night being like, you know, I have evidence, I need to talk to you. And so then they finally talk about things, but it wasn't that dramatic in the book. But then to get into like the events themselves. So we do see like at the lake, a man and a woman, the Zodiac tried to kill them, but the man ended up living. And so he shared his account of it. And in the book, he says how like he and the Zodiac talked for quite a while, and they had like a lengthy conversation just about different things. And we do see that in the movie. He does kind of talk to him a bit, but they talked even more in real life. And then we also get the real account from a guy at the very beginning on the 4th of July. He also survived. And then there's a woman who is driving alone at night, and then this guy picks her up, and then it turns out he's the Zodiac, but then she is able to jump out of the car and she escapes. So we hear her story as well. But in real life, there were more letters from the Zodiac than we see in the movie. And like I said, the book, it's just like more frustrating and more upsetting, the stuff he says in some of his letters. I think the movie talks about this, but how he thinks like the people he kills will be his slaves in the next life. And he just was obviously a crazy person and says some like crazy stuff. But because he was writing these letters, handwriting experts like became a big part of this case, and they tried to find matches to this handwriting. However, the movie does not say this, but in real life, Graysmith realizes that he had like his own alphabet that he would use, and he copied letters from different places. So he would like trace an A from one person's handwriting, and then trace a B from something else, and a C from something else. And so he basically created this like custom alphabet that he would then later trace to write his letters. So it wasn't even his own handwriting because he was tracing the handwriting of like so many other people. And so it got to a point where like they still used handwriting experts, but it wasn't quite the same because they knew he wasn't using his real handwriting. And so it almost became more about like the spacing of letters and things like that were looked at. And so there's a part in the book and movie where he goes to see this guy who worked at a movie theater who worked with a guy that they think could be the Zodiac. And in both, there's a poster that they think is a handwriting match, and they think this other guy wrote it. But when Graysmith goes to see the coworker is like, oh, so-and-so didn't write that poster, I did. And so in the movie, Graysmith is like, wait a minute, what? That means your handwriting is the closest we've ever found. And so it becomes a very ominous, eerie moment. And then they go down in the basement and he thinks he hears someone above him. And then he eventually like runs to leave, but then the door is locked. And so the guy has to come unlock the door for him. And so it's a very tense, suspenseful scene. But in the book, it wasn't quite as tense and suspenseful because the guy does say like, oh, I'm the one who wrote that poster. But Graysmith, he's not really bothered by that because he knows that the Zodiac was copying other people's handwriting. So he's like, well, that makes sense because the Zodiac, he probably just copied some of your handwriting for his letters if he knew you. And so it wasn't, that moment where it's like, uh-oh, wait a minute. And then in the book, he does say that they went down in the basement and he thought he heard someone above him. But in general, that scene in the book was not very ominous at all. And he doesn't try to leave and the door is locked. So the movie definitely fabricated different moments in that scene in order to make it more ominous and suspenseful. And it is a great scene and it's very creepy, but yeah, not quite the true version. And then there are multiple suspects. In the book, he really focuses on these two, one of them being the guy who worked at the movie theater. But the movie, they talk about that movie theater guy, but they focus even more on this guy called Arthur Lee Allen. In the book, he has a different name. It's like Star or something, but I'm just going to call him Allen. So Graysmith and Toschi both think Allen is the Zodiac, but then there was this other guy, the movie theater guy, and some cops think that guy is the killer. And so people are kind of divided on which suspect they liked the best for this case. But the evidence against Allen in the movie is very similar and true to what the evidence is that Graysmith shows in the book. And like I said, Graysmith, he likes Allen for this, and that's who he thinks is the Zodiac. Because he was in Riverside in 1966, and he lived near the place where Darlene, one of the victims, lived, and he had known her. And they also suspect that whoever is the Zodiac had known Darlene. So some of the other victims were just random, but they think that Darlene was someone who the killer had known. And Allen had known Darlene. And then also he had a bloody knife in his car the day of the Lake killings. And he lived in a house with a basement with his mother. And the basements are not common in California, but the Zodiac writes that he has a basement. And Arthur Lee Allen lived in a house with a basement. And he also had the right kind of shoes, which were like these specific military boots. And then he had also been fired from a job for touching children. So he just kind of fit the criteria of being the Zodiac. He also wrote Toschi a typewritten letter after they interviewed him the first time. And he wrote him a letter being like, hey, sorry I wasn't your man. Let me know if I can be of any help. And it's common for the killer to want to stay close to the case. So they often try to help as their way of trying to stay in touch and figure out what's happening with the case. And also just their weird way of playing cat and mouse, Also, I said there was a 4-year silence where they didn't receive any letters from the Zodiac. And guess what? Allen happened to be in prison for those 4 years, which explains the lack of letters. And then the movie has a scene near the end where Graysmith goes to see where Allen works because he tells his wife, he just needs to look in the eyes of the man that he thinks is the Zodiac, and he just needs to see him face to face, and then he'll feel satisfied. And so he goes to see Allen, and they have this, interaction. And this happens in the book as well, but the day he goes to see Allen where he works, he brought his kids. He had his kids stay at the front, and then he went walked through the store to find Allen. So that seemed a little unsafe. But he also went to the store frequently, and he even tailed Allen. So he followed him for a while and was really keeping track of this guy in real life. And then the movie theater guy, they did go see him in person as well. And he went with a female friend because he had some kind of car business or something. And so they went, and the girl acted like she had something she needed done with her car. And the woman, after that interaction, the woman was like, wow, I think it's him. I just got this vibe, and I think it was him the way he acted. Whereas again, Graysmith, he still holds to thinking that Allen was the Zodiac. But the movie does end with, we flash forward to the 1990s, and the guy who survived the 4th of July attack, he is like looking at a lineup, and one of the men in the lineup is a picture of Alan, and he identifies Alan as the killer, because the killer hadn't been wearing a mask that night. However, Alan, before he was questioned, he had like a heart attack and he ended up dying. And the book obviously doesn't have this scene because the book was published in 86, and the movie, like, thanks to the book, that is kind of why they started looking into the case again. So you could say the book was helpful, but at the same time, like, no one was caught even after the book was released. And maybe if Alan had lived, the evidence would have come out that it really was him. But there's still, like, we still don't know for sure if it was Alan or not at the end of the day. But to share some like final thoughts and final comments. So in one of the letters the Zodiac had sent, he had said that he would no longer tell the police which crimes he committed, and they were just going to be random and look like accidents. And so he claimed, like, as the letters went on, he would like show how many people he'd killed. And near the end, it was like an insane number. Like, I don't even remember, but it was a lot. But they don't know for sure. Like, is he just lying? But then he did say that they would look like accidents. So they're like, I don't know, maybe he really did kill that many. I personally think he was probably just lying. So the book does kind of like lean into that, being like, oh, like he may have killed even more than the ones he confessed to. And like there was this crime and this crime. And he kind of, Graysmith writes as if like these other crimes could have also been the Zodiac, even though we don't know for sure. But then in both, we also have the TV personality who goes on a show and they clear the phone lines and they're waiting for the Zodiac to call. And a guy does call and he claims to be the Zodiac, but it was later disproven that it was just someone else, not even connected to the case. And so it was an interesting scene and it was very unnerving. And then the TV personality, I forget his name now, that was a good scene in the movie, and seeing him interact with David Toschi and stuff. And he received personal letters from the Zodiac as well as phone calls. And so his interactions with the Zodiac did provide evidence to the case. But there's also a story in the book in real life where some psychic from like the East Coast claimed to like be getting visions about the Zodiac. And so he comes to California to like get a better impression of things. And he shares his premonitions and his, visions. And he tries to convince the Zodiac to come forward and identify himself. But of course, the Zodiac doesn't do that. And so the psychic just goes home unsuccessful. And then also the Zodiac, he got his name because he gave himself that name. He calls himself the Zodiac. But it seems like, I think in his coded message, maybe he used Zodiac symbols, but they also think that like he also would do things according to like the lunar calendar or something. And then the movie shows Zodiac watches that have a logo similar to the Zodiac's, but that's actually not in the book. But speaking of his coded letters though, the first coded message he sent was cracked by a couple who lived in Salinas. And I was just recently in Salinas, very different topic, but I was there to do the John Steinbeck Museum. But it was a school teacher and his wife, the two of them cracked that first code. And it was kind of interesting in the book about how people go about cracking codes like this and like looking for double letters and so double symbols and figuring that out. And so that actually was pretty interesting. But when it comes to book versus movie, the book does go a bit more in detail into this case, of course, which is to be expected, which again was interesting, but at the same time, it was also like more upsetting too because of that. But even though the movie doesn't go quite as in detail, the movie is very thorough and it is pretty lengthy, like I said, and we do get great performances and it's just very well shot, very atmospheric. And so I would highly recommend the movie. So while editing this, I realized I don't straight up say which one I like better. I mean, you can kind of tell based on how I'm talking, but the movie wins. I did like that better, and that is the one I would recommend to people over the book. If you like find the case fascinating and you want to learn more, then sure, read the book. But honestly, I think if you just watch the movie, I personally think that's enough. But again, if this is just a topic that really interests you, then yeah, maybe you should read the book and you can find out even more information. But yeah, that wraps it up for my book versus movie for Zodiac. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Which when I was in San Francisco, I was at this bakery and a lady was standing beside me, an older lady, and she started talking to me. And she was saying that she's lived in San Francisco for 70 years. And then after I left, I realized like, man, I should have asked her what it was like to live in San Francisco from like 1969 to like the 70s when all of this was happening, right? Like she was there living in the city when this happened, which David Fincher, he lived up in Marin, which is like north of San Francisco, past, over the Golden Gate. And so he said that as a kid, there was a cop driving behind him on their school bus on the way home. And he mentioned it to his dad. And his dad was like, oh yeah, there's some killer loose that claimed he was going to shoot a bus. So that's why cops are following you. And then my mom actually lived in like Hayward, I think, which is in the Bay Area. And so I asked her if she remembered this time. She was younger, but She didn't ride the school bus either, and so she said that she doesn't really specifically remember anything about this. But yeah, that older lady, I should have asked her and got some inside information on what it was like to live in San Francisco when this was going on. But yeah, anyway, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're a Jake Gyllenhaal fan, then I will link to Stronger, which is another Jake Gyllenhaal movie I recently covered, so maybe you will like that if you're a Gyllenhaal fan. I have also done Nocturnal Animals and Enemy, so if any of those interest you, I have videos for all of them. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!